Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar to do a high-level overview migration of 18,001 to ISO 45,001. This is being recorded and all information will be sent to you at the end of the session, and there'll be an opportunity for questions along the way, so please use that chat box down below. I have a colleague who is helping me out and sending me the questions as they come along. So if we don't get them during the presentation, right at the very end, we'll go through them and make sure that everyone has their questions answered for this session. And again, just a reminder that everybody is currently in mute, so the chat box is the best opportunity for you to raise questions during the session. And of course, after this session, there is contact information that will be included with the broadcast here, and you'll be able to reach out to NQA, and we'll be able to take care of any other needs that you have. So we'll move forward with the introduction of ISO 45,001. This standard is known as a migration from 18,001, mostly because there are two different standard organizations. The 18,001 was a British standard, and the International Standards Organization is now the carrier of the safety management system and has named it 45,001, of course. And this brings a lot of fantastic advantages that we'll speak to as we go through, but as an overview, it's bringing the broader brand of ISO to the marketplace, and it's creating and adopting a structure that will integrate very well into other management systems. And overall, the 45,001 system is designed to create occupational health and safety performance in using risk-based thinking within the culture, and it's using risk throughout the entire thought process of how a management system is designed, planned, executed, measured, and improved. So it's really based upon output of intended outcomes that are all based on the culture of the organization and its risk appetite for the ultimate success of worker safety and avoidance of ill health. The structure of 45,001 is based on Annex SL. This is a new structure that's been adopted recently and implemented by the International Standards Organization for continuity across standards and how they're written. ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 have recently adopted this structure, and 45,001 is following suit. Again, it's an arrangement to consistently write a standard in a specific way, and as you see here on the screen, there's 10 sections. It starts off with the scope of the standard, any references that are going to be included to the standard that are external, terms and conditions and definitions, and that sets the foundation for the execution of the standard, the auditable clauses of sections 4 through 10. This is the same for, as I said, with 14,000 and 9,000 as far as sections go. But each standard has unique nuances in the subclauses as pertain to the standard requirements. So when we look at, say, Section 8 in operational control, though it may be the same section as other standards, we're going to be referring to the operational controls as they adhere to the safety. So let's look at the processes. At the center is the cultural change and improved performance for an organization. So this standard is going to be adopted to give that foundational approach that's consistently applied throughout the organization. And it's going to be supported by the context of the organization. So We'll speak about the context a little bit later, but in short, it's understanding all of the influences to your organization, both external and internal, and how those apply to the organization's activities and the purpose and strategic direction. Part of that context is going to be your interested parties. So when you look at your interested parties, these are the people who and entities that must be considered. You need to understand who they are, what the needs are, and then further, whether or not you're going to adopt those needs, which is important to the standard, because if you decide to adopt the needs of interested parties, they will be considered as legal obligations. Adding to the context of the organization is where we move into the support of that, and that's going to be the leadership. The leadership has really been a section that's improved a lot with the 45,001 standard. There is a lot of requirements, but they're very well prescribed, and it's natural to the way that organizations currently operate, if you will. And so when we look at the strategy, the policies, the roles, responsibilities, so on and so forth, it's going to be a natural progression. And the way the standard is written, it's going to be more of how do you adopt the standard to fit your organization, and less of how do you change your organization to fit the standard. So the modernization of the standard is actually going to be a fantastic revelation once it's released and you all start implementing it. So once the organization is understood and we understand who is influencing it, what the obligations are, and the leadership is in place, understanding what the direction is going to be, the planning section is probably the most important, because it's here that you'll use your risk assessments, both on the physical and mental hazards that exist in the workplace, but also the risks that occur through change management. So in all of your other business processes, if something is to change, what are the risks that exist through the interactions of the different management systems, the different processes, and maybe even how it affects externally to the organization, what those risks, what the impacts are going to be outside of the organization. So planning is going to be a very essential part of the standard, and it's reflected with a very voluminous amount of information and requirements, again, that makes sense. Most of the requirements that are there are likely things that you're already doing. There are some new themes, if you will, but generally speaking, there isn't going to be anything that's introduced that is going to be a challenge for most organizations to achieve, because, quite frankly, planning is how organizations succeed in the first place. So it should be a natural progression again. When we look at Section 7 and 8, this is where the resources are allocated to the plans that were created in Section 6. This is where you determine what the competencies are going to be, who's going to be involved with training those competencies, how are those competencies going to be evaluated, but it's also going to go into the awareness. You may have competent people, but are they aware and familiar with the conditions in which they're working? And that awareness is going to be a very important part of the standard. It is a little bit new with the introduction of certain themes and requirements, so it would be very important to spend a little time there. And the communication part of the standard, which is 7.4, this is the glue. This is how all of these pieces come together, and again, very well prescribed. And what we're looking for is, how do you identify what needs to be communicated, who is going to do the communication, and how are you going to document communication if it's necessary? So again, a very important part to the entire standard, but no real new implementations that are going to be required. It really just prescribes it a lot easier for organizations to implement, and also for organizations to monitor and measure, because the way that it's laid out. The documented information section, there's the biggest contrast between the 18,000 and 45,000 is that you're not going to see documented procedures required in every single clause. It doesn't mean that documentation is not required. In fact, there's many places where documentation is required, and the language has changed a little bit to be documented information instead of documented procedures, if you will. But you'll see the word maintain. Maintaining means or implies that it's some sort of documented information that is going to require to be in place and subject to controls. Retain is a phrase that's introduced to infer that there's going to be a record that needs to be retained and controlled, again, to some sort of a documented information control process. So both these sections, and section 7 and this section 8 that we're looking at, this is how we're going to execute the plan in section 6. So when we look at section 8, hierarchy of controls remains paramount. Obviously, we want to look at the risks to the organization in regards to safety and health, and we want to eliminate, if at all possible, any of those risks. And when we follow that hierarchy of control, that is a strategy that has obviously been tested over time and is absolutely necessary, and is also included and carried through with this new standard. Change management, again, it was always important to have controls around change management. It has a more prominent role in this standard, and it's to take the risks and opportunities from section 6 and understand when change happens to implement a new risk update, if you will, to understand how that change is going to affect the system that's currently in place. So again, it's not always in regards to a new hazard that's introduced to the organization or a function or workplace. It has a lot also to do with changing processes. So if there's a new wing that's being introduced to the organization, or a new line, or a new an acquisition, or things like that, it's these other processes that must be considered as part of that change management, and how it's going to affect the organization legally and otherwise. Procurement, again, something that was always necessary to look at in 18,001, but has its own clause now, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, I believe. And the procurement is really speaking to the decisions that the organization is making through their purchasing programs that are in line with the policy and the goals and intended outcomes of the management system. So the idea here is using contractors and outsource services that are in line with your policy, and also have the capability to deliver the contracted processes or outsourced services in a very safe manner that protects their employees as well. So it's your function that's being outsourced, but the idea is that you're not going around the responsibilities of safety to an organization that doesn't have any safety culture whatsoever. And so it's kind of using the process and procurement to look at whether or not the supply chain that you have is supporting your goals and missions in regards to the safety strategies. Emergency preparedness hasn't changed a whole lot. The idea is to obviously plan and be prepared for emergencies as they occur, and also linking back to change management. When an emergency happens, using that monitoring and measuring to assess whether or not the response is appropriate and making certain changes as appropriate. When we get into the monitoring and measuring, internal auditing, management review, these things are all common processes that existed in the 18,000. None of this is new, but there are definitely some new themes that have been introduced into how they're executed. So we'll talk about those in the next slides coming up. So what is the starting point? Well, the starting point really is understanding what the context of the organization is. Again, who's involved within the context, and what's the leadership's overall commitment and understanding of the organization, and what is their strategic direction. From these three ingredients, the scope of the management system has been or will be defined, and from this scope, the rest of the management flows. So it's very important to spend the time in this area to really identify what all of the influences are that affect the organization's ability to achieve successful outcomes. So what is the context of the organization? Well, when we think about it, it's in many ways, how and why does the organization exist? What are all of the ingredients that allow an organization to be successful? What are the issues that affect the organization's ability to move forward? And what are the tools and resources that an organization has, needs, or can get access to overcome those challenges within a certain environment? And so that environment really is the effect to the organization, and the ability of the organization to move through that environment defines its context. So when we think about all these different types of organizations that are here on the slide, each one has very different approaches and very different ingredients, but at the end of the day, the outputs are the same. It's to reach intended outcomes that enhance performance, achieve the fulfillment of legal obligations, and meets the objectives set by the organization. So when we look at a very high level to this section 4, this is very new. Of course, this did not exist in the 18,001. This is part of the Annex SL adoption of ISO. And this foundation is broken into these sections here, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and 4.4. And so once an organization understands its context and who the interested parties are, it will endeavor to define that scope. And with that scope needs to be documented. And from there, the management system framework is developed and defined within section 4.4. So when we think of these things, you're going to have external factors. And using a pestle analysis, this is one method or tool to identify the different external factors that may affect your organization. And you can consider these as like buckets, if you will. And you take legal. What are all the legal factors that are affecting your organization? What are the political factors? Obviously, politics has an effect on legal obligations. It also has certain influences to culture. So really important to think of things outside of the norms that you normally consider, such as just legal and resources, if you will. We want to look at outside influences. Technology, as it evolves, that's going to have certain influences to the technology that's instituted today. And economic viability, as economies grow and thrive, there's often a lot more resources available to programs such as safety. And when times get a little tough, sometimes it's pulled back, and it makes resources more difficult to get or invest in. So it's really important to understand what these buckets are, how many that you have, and fill them up with specifics. The more specific you identify your external factors, the more successful the planning stage will be. When we consider the internal factors, everything is very much connected. And so, again, these are all different buckets. And these are the things that affect an organization internally that an organization has more control over. So it's not complete control, of course, because there's still factors that change based on other influences. But an organization definitely has a lot more control and balance when considering these things. So it's important to note that some external factors could also be internal factors once you dive in and you see how they affect the organization themselves. An example could be unions. You know, there could be external influences from a union, but also because the unions are adopted within the culture of the organization, there's going to be internal factors as well. So really important to understand that these are not in isolation. They can be work together, and it's in some ways cross-pollinate, but very important to try to get as detailed as you can. Once you understand what the buckets look like, fill those buckets with the factors as specific as possible so that you can understand the risks in the planning process. So when we consider 4.2 and the workers and the interested parties, this is also a new theme, if you will, concept, and it's essential to understanding the context, of course, but as I indicated earlier, understanding the needs and then adopting the needs as legal obligations is a very important clause, and needs some really good due diligence, because obviously not every interested party needs to be adopted as a legal requirement, but typically contractual agreements will precipitate out, as well will certain different organizations that you may be involved with or subscribe to. Those supporting organizations may have very important needs that, based on your participation with them, really need to be adopted and demonstrated within your management system as legal obligations. So after considering the context and the party, again, as I said earlier, that's where your scope is going to be established. It's going to define the boundaries, both the physical boundaries, the legal boundaries, and the management system will consider all of the risks and opportunities within the boundary of that scope to operate efficiently. So Section 5, as I explained earlier, is all about leadership, and it's a very big section. Consultation and participation, as we know, is a very important part of the 18,000. It's been organized and reshaped, if you will, in this leadership area under Section 5.4. And the other thing that happened is the requirement for a management representative did not necessarily go away, but the roles changed. And what was identified was that over time, top management and leadership delegated the roles, responsibilities, authority, and the accountability in some ways to the management representative. So the ISO, through the Annex SL and the rewriting of the standards, has reinstated through proclamation of 5.1 subclause A, accountability. And what it's really making a strong statement is that top management has always been understood to be accountable, but the demonstration of accountability must be maintained, and it can't be delegated. While the authority, roles, responsibilities shall be delegated out, which is, obviously important, the accountability must be retained by the management team. And so this is a very strong statement in Section 5, in the first clause, in the first subclause of A, that's stated around that. And it's a theme that carries throughout the rest of the standard. The top management and the leadership is responsible to develop the policy. That policy shall be made available as documented information. And so there's a lot of influences to the policy, which includes the points and views of participation from non-managed workers. And you'll see that within the standard when it's released, but there is a section in 5.4 in the participation area where workers are to be considered when the policy is being created. So some really important themes that when this is rolled out and you start digesting and seeing what these clauses are, that at the very beginnings of the implementation of the management system, worker participation is vitally important. Also to note, at that second bullet, is this is not just about accidents. The management system and the standard has modernized to reflect modern realities, which are becoming more social in nature. We're seeing a lot of things around the ill health that are happening due to harassment in the workplace, bullying in the workplace. In some cases, the workloads that are just overtaxing individuals to the point that they're exhausted from being overworked with either too many shifts, too much responsibility, so on and so forth, and they're making mistakes, which is putting them in harm's way. So it's not just around the physical accidents that occur to bodily injury, if you will, or it's not even necessarily isolated to physical guarding against accidents like machine guarding or fencing and so on. It's modernized to the point of understanding that the employee is a holistic being and that safety includes social and mental considerations to be included beyond just physical. So we discussed the organizational roles and responsibilities. Once they're established, they need to be available as documented information. And as I indicated with section 5.4, this is a section that requires an awful lot of information to be reviewed because it changed a lot. As many of you may have seen the original DIS, that was the draft international standard that came out about 2 years ago. And that was revised with the second DIS and revised again with the FDIS. So there's been a lot of changes. It's a very, very important section of the standard. And without moving forward, you have to really consider how participation and consultation processes are going to work so that they can be imported into your planning process. So leadership, as there was a question that came up, is what's the difference between leadership and management? Management happens and occurs at a lot of different levels within the organization, and you can manage a process, and all of it is a leadership position at some level. And so this is where the section, if you will, go back to Annex SL, the section was defined as leadership to include all management and all activities that are leading in nature. So again, when we think about this section of consultation and participation of workers, workers can be leaders, though they may not be management. And when you look at 5.4, there's going to be, again, responsibilities that top management needs to consider of the workers in the workplace. And those workers may be leads. And so this section 5 has really been defined to bring in the components that are very specific in nature to leadership type activities. So when we move into that planning, I indicated the hierarchy of controls. That remains. We know that this is the most effective approach thus far to ensuring that there is success for management systems and safety in general when you take this approach. The more that we can eliminate and physically get rid of the hazard, the more success that we're going to have, obviously. So all the different pieces of planning need to look at this hierarchy of controls and start with, can it be eliminated? And if not, start using your risk process to determine the at what level the operational control is going to require to successfully reduce any incidents, accidents, or incidents of ill health. So really important to maintain the hierarchy of controls in your planning process. And when we look at the clauses, this is where this standard really starts to show its maturity into a process-based type management system, because the inputs into planning require 4.1 and 4.2. And when the standard's released, you'll see that there's references throughout the entire standard that references other clauses within the standard to really compound and illustrate that you cannot achieve conformance to the clause without considering the effects and the impacts and the risks from decisions made in other clauses. So this is definitely not a checklist-based type standard. It is not something that can be delegated in isolation. It definitely requires a holistic approach for risks and opportunities, and the planning is essential, because in the planning is where you're going to also develop your change management process. Because let's face it, a plan is a plan until it's implemented, and once it's implemented, continuous improvement opportunities start to take place, and the plans change. And as soon as they change, you have to identify what those effects are going to be. The other thing is sometimes plans don't always happen or produce outputs that were planned. And so again, that has to be assessed in that monitoring and measuring piece and say, okay, time for a new plan. So the way that the planning clauses are laid out, they're very prescriptive. And it's just really, I think, one of the most important pieces to remember is it's not just about the hazard itself. It really is about the risks of change. So consider that when you're implementing your management system. So the risk management follows in many ways, this model, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. There is no formal risk management program that is required to be adopted by the standard. Every organization is free to develop its own type of risk process, but essentially the components are typically found to be the same. And if you use this model, great. If you have a different way to achieve successful risk assessment, fantastic. But generally speaking, you have to look at the different components within your organization and understand what level of control is going to be required to achieve a successful outcome. The Section 7 support is exactly just that. I talked about it earlier in this presentation. This is where you're going to develop your competencies awareness. You're going to do your document controlling, and it's where you're going to have your communication. So all of this is the foundational glue around around this, the successful connecting points from the plan to the operational controls and the monitoring and measuring. All of these are prescribed, again, pretty well around who, what, where, when, how, and understanding what your process is for communication is probably one of the most important parts within Section 7. Not much to speak to here that hasn't already been discussed. So again, when the standard's released, it's pretty much an easy read, and almost every organization that I've ever been in and audited has these things locked down pretty well, except for communication. Communication is one of those things that's always evolving, and there's always new ways to communicate. There's always new people to communicate with, and a lot of that has to do with change, because once a communication plan is in place, it's established, but then once something changes, again, if the change management process isn't very robust, then communication is usually one of the first casualties. And when communication breaks down, it has a ripple effect throughout the entire organization. So really important to ensure that your communication process is extremely robust. So when we think about the operations section here, it is definitely important to understand how it's changed. There are new themes. There are a lot of influences that are going to be required. What I mean by that is the ability of the organization to influence other factors. And so it's not just about the operational control, but it's the opportunity of ensuring that that control goes beyond the most obvious hazards that exist, and it goes beyond sometimes the boundaries of the organization itself when it's considering contractors and outsourcing, and in fact also, you know, the neighbors, if you will, within your community. And it also has certain controls that are ensuring through requirements that as your employees are leaving the physical site, that they are also in a safe environment. So whether or not they're using company vehicles that are safe, or that there's a process in place for them to arrive at a site that you've commissioned the work at, and that they have the necessary tools to do a site assessment to ensure that they're working in a safe environment on the behalf of the organization. So it's not about the site. It has expanded to, you know, to ensure that influences and reach are protecting employees, contractors, and outsourced employees as well. Considering how we're going to monitor and manage the management system is going to be very, very important, because what's being added here is the evaluation. So it's not just about watching something and recording the measurements. It's evaluating through analysis. What is the data explaining to you? Because that data analysis is extremely important. That's how you're going to determine whether or not your performance is meeting the intended outcomes, exceeding the intended outcomes, or not meeting the goals and objectives set by the organization. And only through that analysis, and a good analysis, can you feed that back into the planning process to understand what types of changes need to be made and applied to ensure that the system is in alignment with the strategic direction of the organization. Very important note is in the section of internal audits. There is a clause within the internal audit program that relates to what the output of the audit results, what happens to that output. Typically, we understand that that becomes information that's used and fed into the management process through decision making and management review. But in this case, there's also some requirements to flow it down to the workers and those that are directly involved, in some cases interested parties. And they are going to be required to have access, and this is where the communication program comes in really important, to the audit results themselves. So really important to pay attention to this area. Management review, not a lot's changed there. There's been some new clauses that are added, new components that are part of the shall, if you will. But again, pretty prescriptive, and follow right along with it, and you'll see how the interactions of the other sections of the standard feed into the management review to ultimately feed where we're going next, which is into the continual improvement. What is most notable in this section is that preventive action disappears. So that was we had corrective action and preventive action in the previous standard. Preventive action is now, in words, absent, but it hasn't gone away. Really what happened is preventive action is embedded in the risks and opportunities and then supported in 10.3 with continual improvement. So really what they did is it moved preventive action all the way into section 6. As a matter of fact, in section 6 there's its own clause called opportunities, and opportunities has very little to do with focusing on the risk of a hazard. It's more looking at the opportunity to avoid a hazard in the first place. And so there was, a lot when 9,000 and 14,001 standards were released. There was a lot of talk around preventive action is no longer required, and in fact that's not true. And it, as I just described, it's embedded throughout the entire management system now. What is also important to know is that in section 10.2, the idea here around incidents is that nonconformities that they need to be investigated. Obviously, nonconformities are going to be resultant, and there's going to be a requirement to look at other potential opportunities for that same incident to have occurred. So the incidents cannot just be focusing on, or the investigations can't be just focusing on the incident in isolation. It is going to be a requirement to look at elsewhere, if you will, that a hazard, risk, or incident can or may occur. So, as indicated, all of these clauses fit into the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, and looking at how this model goes together, you can see where the sections live. In Section 5, leadership, well, as indicated or as I described earlier, leadership occurs at all levels within the organization. So it is core and central to everything that happens, and leadership is expected to be involved at all parts of the Plan, Do, Act cycle. The inputs and the outputs are very, very clear. So you really will have a challenge in your planning section if you don't understand the context of your organization, if you don't really drill down into the buckets of to the specifics that really define the organization. And then the intended outcomes, you need to do your analysis. You need to understand what is the purpose in the first place for putting a management system in place. Those obviously will be defined as goals and objectives, but then you have to have the ability to analyze your data to understand whether or not your performance needs improvement, is just adequate, or it's well and above what your intended outcomes were to begin with. So really important to know that at a minimum, the standard does define 3 minimum requirements for intended outcomes, and that is the successful achievement of your objectives, the fulfillment of your compliance obligations, and the enhancement of your health and safety performance. So in order to assess your current management system to the previous standard 18,001, NQA has put together this gap guide. The standard is expected to be released next week, and everything I presented to you so far is from the final draft. We don't have any insight to what the final publication of the standard is going to look like. We'll all know together once it's released. We don't expect any material changes, and so to help prepare all of you and ourselves, of course, for the approach to the 45,001 standard, we did have to go through the exercise of understanding what are the gaps. So this will be made available to you and on our website. So I definitely encourage you to go there. What we did is we contrasted what the previous requirements were in 18,001, what the new requirements are, and from there, it should give you really good guidance as a tool to understand what you need to do to conform to the new requirements as they're laid out. There is the 3-year rule. So for any of you who have been through transitions before, there is typically a 3-year transition. But I don't want to use the word transition in this case. Really, it's appropriate to say migration because we are migrating from one standard to another. But the 3-year rule exists, and what that means is once the standard is released, 3 years from that date, the previous standard will be retired, and 18,001 will be retired, and that has been announced by BSI. So 45,001 will be the new standard moving forward, and 3 years from now, it will be the only standard certificated to through the accreditation process. So if you need to make that migration, then the gap guide is going to be extremely helpful. And please note that even though it's 3 years, don't wait until the last minute. One, resources are finite, so there's only so many auditors out there, and there's a lot of certificates, and if everyone waits to the last minute, it just can't be done. It also, early adopters, it'll give you a lot of time to start maturing and taking advantage of all of these new concepts. And so these concepts are really, really good. They've modernized, and it'll get your management system on track much, much faster. So really find that sweet spot that works for your organization. But I definitely can say that that last year is really a crunch time. So try to figure out how you're going to make this implementation in the first 2 years. And the practical tips. If you're starting from scratch, cover to cover, please read the standard. Not just section 4 through 10, but there's an annex. The annex is fantastic. It clarifies a lot of the intent of the clauses, and they're directly related. So you know, if section 8.1 has probably an annex 8.1 section, and so it'll go into further detail. There's also an implementation guide, 18,000, and I forget the actual number. I think it's 18,002 is what currently is out there, and this will be a 45,000. Yeah, 45,002, and that implementation guide will be helpful, and we'll go into further clarification of many of the standard clauses. So with both of those documents, you'll have all the information that you need to successfully implement. And really important, of course, to identify where to get your information on legal requirements. And getting that source will help you identify with much greater success. And as you're migrating, that gap analysis is going to be really important for you, because starting from scratch, you're going to build to the new standard, to the new clauses. Obviously, if you're migrating, you've got things in place, and that management of change is going to be essential. So please don't overlook that management of change. And no certification can be complete until the standard is actually published. So we have question and answers. I saw one that was brought up to me earlier and answered. As we explained, this information will go out to you with contact information, not that you just see here, but there'll be other contact information available as well. We are an international organization, so this particular presentation is also being facilitated through our United Kingdom office, which is what this contact information is here in the United States, that when you receive the information here, that contact information will be updated. So I thank you all very much for your time. Please visit NQA's website often. We will update content, be releasing tools, and as the standard itself, once it's released, as this implementation matures, I'm certain that we're going to have other blogs of information, and we'll also probably have other webinars to keep you up to date with any changes or new understandings of interpretations. So again, thank you very much for your time, and we hope to be in touch again soon.